So by a show of hands, how many of you have sent money across borders? Okay, so that looks like pretty much everyone. I'm going to tell you a story. So typically, when we look at remittances, we take an aggregated view. So corridors like US to Mexico, US to India, or US to China, and we look at these global flows. But today, we're going to zoom in and look at what it would take an individual to actually send money from one part of the world across to another. So a friend of yours has come to you wanting to send money back home. You are a bona fide expert in digital financial services, especially since you're here at the summit. And so you graciously accept. But what if you're not sending money to Mamadou in Dhaka or to Mercy in Nairobi, relatively easier locations on the African continent to get money to? But what if your recipient was in a remote village called Yekoua in Niger? And this is where your headache begins. But you are undeterred, and you start by asking your recipient, and it turns out he has a smartphone, thank God, and he has WhatsApp too. So you ask for the local cash out options, and you quickly get a snapshot. The first two are money transfer services in Niger, and even though their website advertises international transfers, it's really only for the French CFA region. So a practical dead end for you. The third, BNIF bank, is a local bank, and not even a top-tier one. You know, the global corresponding banking network is cumbersome and expensive. And you have no idea to find out even if this bank is part of the SWIFT network or not. The other two options here are mobile money. So Zemani is an Orange subsidiary, and judging by previous experiences of French banks, you know that this is going to be a uniquely frustrating can of worms. Airtel, on the other hand, is an Indian conglomerate, not restricted by European banking laws. So, Airtel it is. Needless to say, you can't Zelle money from your Bank of America account to Niger. So, you download the Airtel Money app. But this is also a dead end, because it turns out you need a local number to activate a mobile money account. So being in the know, you go to a price comparison website called Monito, and Monito tells you that World Remit is the solution that you could use. But you're disappointed to find out that World Remit has discontinued their transfers to Niger. You've heard up-and-coming things about a fintech unicorn called Chipper Cash. They have funded to the tune of $300 million. And even though they're based in the US, they don't yet do transfers to Niger. Back to square one. At this point, you can throw up your hands and go for the tried and tested Western Union. But the fees are high, and the distance for your recipient to the agent is far. So, after fiddling around with Google search parameters, you come upon EasyPay. Now, you've never heard of EasyPay before. You have no idea where they're based. And because you're a bona fide expert, you need to do some due diligence to keep your credibility intact. So you plug away, no red flags turn up, and quite frankly, you're out of options, and this is your only lead. So you go ahead, and for less than 10%, you're able to transfer the funds from the United States to Yekoua in Niger, 3% to move the money from your Visa card to EasyPay, 3% to pay your recipient, and another 3% for him to cash out. And even though this transaction only took you a few minutes to execute, it took you days to put together this globally fragmented puzzle, monitor each step of the process to get the funds to your recipient. And as you bask in the satisfaction of having done it, you ask yourself, how many migrants would have the patience and the resources to do what you just did? Now imagine if each email you sent had a different pricing structure, and depending on who you were writing to, that the costs would go higher the poorer your recipient is. Now, this is the state of remittances today. So if you wanted to send $50, it would cost 10 times more than sending $1,000. And we know that $50 goes a long way in an emerging market. But you'd say, Arunjay, that's small, low value. It's going to be expensive. You don't know how the payment system works. There's a lot of costs. These providers don't really want to serve such small transactions. So let me ask you this. Is $1,000 $1,000? Right? It should be. But I'd say wrong. It really depends who the $1,000 belong to. So imagine two people wanting to send money from the US to Mexico, one of whom is an affluent customer. He or she would get preferential rates and therefore more pesos compared to the other customer who's less fortunate, even though the amount is the same. So this is not only a low-value problem, it is a problem for particularly blue-collared migrants. And what this really means is that it's expensive to be poor. So today, phone calls, text messages, and emails are completely interoperable. You see, if we could only call somebody on Verizon, it wouldn't be particularly useful. Or T-Mobile, for example. So it's the interconnectivity between the networks that give it its utility. And this is also true for email. So in terms of an email, if you could only send to everyone on your internet service provider, say AOL, for example, again, it wouldn't be very valuable. But let's say that the internet service providers in the 1990s got together and instead of what we have today, set up bilateral connections with each other. So the various 1,000 internet service providers connected to one another in a similar fashion to what correspondent banking is. Even then, you wouldn't have Gmail, because by the time Gmail came along 10 years later, it wouldn't be possible even for Google to go and connect to all of these internet service providers, even assuming that those internet service providers will be willing to let Google integrate with them. So we asked the question, why can't we send money the same way we could send email? Similar to what I saw when I came in on Friday, Interledger aiming to do, making money as easy as sending an email. And when we exchange emails, I don't need to know your email service provider, your internet service provider, whether you're receiving the email on Gmail or Outlook or on your mobile or desktop. I can simply send that email knowing that you would receive it. But when it comes to sending remittances, the equivalent of all of those pieces of information is required. And that doesn't roll off the tongue. In fact, most people have to go on a treasure hunt to find all the different pieces of information they need to do such a transfer. So 30 years after email achieved interoperability, in terms of payments, we aren't there yet today. This is clearly not a technology problem, neither is the solution technology. If we can make email work, make payments work like email, then sending money to anyone, anywhere, just like you can call, message, or email, should be possible. And this means sending money from one network to another without knowing or needing to know which payment network your recipient is part of. Today, payment networks make one connection, a bilateral connection, with another network and call themselves interoperable. That same one connection, they call themselves open networks. But in reality, what we need is the ability for everybody to be connected to everyone. And in this exploratory paper, we propose such a solution. Now, I think we know that today, remittances are expensive, they're slow, they're fragmented, and they're non-transparent. And frankly, this is an underwhelming experience for all parties concerned. So an open, regulated global payment network would bring together all of the existing networks. And this is kind of what it would look like. It's not a new system, but it connects existing systems. So no matter whether it is incumbents like SWIFT, Visa, MasterCard, or some of the newer networks like Ripple, Stellar, Cello, a payment should be able to go from one to another. So we see this happening in 3 phases. The first is account addressing. So this is a global directory that would allow you to address a payment in the same way you have an email address. The second is tokenized compliance, reducing or rather finding efficiencies in compliance to reduce the cost. And the third is real-time settlement of funds. So some of you here might have heard of the G20 roadmap for enhancing cross-border payments. 2 years ago, the G20 came together and mandated the CPMI and the FSB to come up with a roadmap. So our work here, ties in to this roadmap, and we're leveraging it, working with the industry, convening the industry, bringing the industry together to work on this. So I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on how each of the 3 phases will solve the problems that we face today. So I talked about account addressing, and in the earlier example where we didn't need to know all of these different pieces of information to send an email. On this, similarly, using an alias to identify your bank account reduces friction for the uptake of remittances or payments in general. So mobile money, which is about 15 years old, uses a mobile number, which effectively is an alias. In India, the IMPS, which is the Instant Payment Network, started in 2011. But it was only in 2016, with the advent of the Unified Payment Interface, allowing primarily mobile numbers within each of the apps like Google Pay and PhonePe, that it really took off. And more recently, Pix in Brazil uses aliases. And so our vision here is to bring together payment directories that exist today, the likes of UPI in India or Pix in Brazil, but also PayPal in the US, Zelle, and Square Cash, and Venmo even. So Venmo uses mobile numbers, PayPal uses email addresses. They all use aliases, and which is why it's so much easier to send money through one of these services than it is to go to your bank's website and put in all of the different information. So these directories exist, and our goal is to connect them in a federated architecture, and for service providers to query this and get back an LEI which would represent the recipient's bank, as well as the payment systems that the recipient's bank is part of. And this would allow you to make a payment using the rails that exist today. Phase 2 is to improve the efficiency of compliance. So today, a transaction has to be sanction screened, PEP checked, AML, CFT, all of that by every intermediary in the chain. Typically, there are 4, the sending and receiving bank, and at least 2 in between. And the cheapest cost you're going to have to do that check is 50 cents. So that's $2 of cost for the transaction alone on compliance. And so therefore, if you're trying to send $20, that's 10%. So by signing a token, the compliance provider who does that can sign a token and pass it along the transaction, and each of the financial institutions can check what was done. The third phase is real-time settlement. So today, almost all money transfer works on a pre-funded model where the money is parked in the country ahead of time. So what that means is that the money that you send me is not the money that I receive. The money that you send in the US stays in the US, and I get paid out from a pre-funded bucket. But for providers, that means they have to pre-fund that money, which is a cost of liquidity. It's also a cost of FX exposure, because they put the money there ahead of time, waiting for transactions to occur. And none of these currencies appreciate against the dollar, at least not very often. And so it brings a substantial cost to transactions. And so we see a world where money can move in real time, or settlement can be done in real time. And that would reduce the cost substantially. So as I finish, in terms of the timeline of what we've been through, so we've done a very wide consultation process, spoken to over 30 different stakeholders, so 11 central banks, the public sector, World Bank, IMF, BIS, etc., and many of the leading private sector actors. In July this year, we had a workshop where we had the likes of Visa, MasterCard, SWIFT, the BIS Innovation Hub representing Project Nexus, as well as Mojaloop. And we started to work on phase 1. In August, we published the exploratory paper, and we also shared a draft for the technical paper for phase 1, which we're expecting to publish next month. So early next year, we are aiming to put together a pilot, a proof of concept of about at least 3 networks where the alias, or payment pointers in the language of Interledger, would operate across different networks. So, in summary, our goal is to speed up total interoperability. And I'm going to steal the 3 words from Jordan's presentation yesterday and tell you that by allowing users to easily access the accounts by using aliases as proxies, we're going to, first word, increase the volume of digital transfers. And by reducing the cost and improving compliance and liquidity through real-time settlement, we're going to, second word, improve the infrastructure. And together, by increasing the volume and improving the infrastructure, we're going to make remittances cheaper, not just for all of you in this room, but everyone in this world. Thank you.